As we go to air this morning, Russian forces have breached Ukraine's capital. Tanks and troops rolling through northern districts of Kyiv, Russia now on the doorstep of Ukraine's democracy. NATO has confirmed this morning that it will be deploying more troops to Eastern Europe. And in the last few hours, Russian President Vladimir Putin has released a new message, essentially asking Ukrainian soldiers to overthrow their government.
Do not let Banderites and neo-Nazis use your children, wives and old people as human shields. Take power into your own hands. It looks like it will be easier for us to come to an agreement than with this gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis that has settled in Kyiv and taken hostage the entire Ukrainian people.
All right, so let's break down the events so far. We're seeing what's called a pincer movement from Russian troops. That is, soldiers coming in from both the north and from the east in wide fronts. We know that Russia has taken control of the Chernobyl reactor. There are airstrikes on Odessa. That's on the shore of the Black Sea. Russia now has turned its attention to Kyiv. Missile strikes hammering the capital and a rocket fragment landing in a residential building. In the last hour, Kyiv's mayor says 5 blasts have been heard in the city, and what we're seeing there is simply astonishing. A tank filmed running over a civilian car, crushing the vehicle, but incredibly, the man in that car survived. He was pulled from the wreckage by civilians. Across the city, 18,000 guns have now been given to volunteers as the government calls on all citizens to defend the city.
We have reporters covering every angle of this crisis. First to Europe correspondent Kyiv Greenbank in Kyiv. Good morning to you, Kari. The battle for Kyiv is now well underway.
Good morning, Jane. Well, it is. And just a few moments ago, we've actually moved down to our building's bunker because we've been hearing quite an increase in this bombardment, this aerial bombardment of Kyiv and around Kyiv. We're hearing reports now that the Russian troops are targeting power plants, but what we've seen today is that for the first time we've had these Russian troops, these Russian tanks rolling into the northern districts of Kyiv. They have come up against strong resistance from Ukrainian fighters. We've also seen that really disturbing footage, which I think you just mentioned there, of a Russian tank lining up and running over a civilian car. There was an elderly man inside that car. Somehow, miraculously, he has survived and he was pulled clear of that. But we are hearing now the Ukrainian government has said that it is arming anyone who wants to fight. So it's got 18,000 guns and ammunition that it's handing out to people who will fight for Ukraine. It is also telling people to make Molotov cocktails to defend themselves. Now, President Zelensky has released a video a short time ago essentially saying that, look, he is still here in Kyiv, and that was to counteract Russian reports that he had fled the capital. Here's that video now.
Good evening, everyone. The leader of the fraction is here. The head of the president's administration is here. Prime Minister Shmyhal is here. Podolyak is here. The president is here. We are all here. Our military are here. Citizens and society are here. We are all here defending our independence, our state, and it will remain so. Glory to our defenders. Glory to our women defenders. Glory to Ukraine.
Now, Ukraine has been calling on Russia to negotiate. Russia has just said that it will negotiate, but only if Ukraine demilitarises, which essentially means surrender. So that's something Ukraine is simply not going to do. US intelligence officials are now saying that the capital could fall in days. Jane?
Kyiv Greenbank there at Kyiv, thank you. And now to our US correspondent Alison Petrowski, who's in Washington, D.C. And Ali, the US president has spoken to his Ukrainian counterpart this morning. Do we know what they said?
Yeah, that's right, Jane. Good morning to you. Both the leaders hopped on a phone call a short time ago. It was the first time that they had spoken since Putin's troops invaded Ukraine. We understand it was a 40-minute phone call and that Zelensky asked for more sanctions against Russia and also more defence assistance from the United States. Zelensky taking to Twitter afterwards, tweeting, strengthening sanctions, concrete defence assistance and an anti-war coalition have just been discussed with the President of the United States. Grateful to America for the strong support to Ukraine. Now, Jane, this call came after an emergency meeting of NATO leaders, which Joe Biden was a part of. The leaders of nation states were discussing the way forward when dealing with Vladimir Putin. Let's hear from the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg.
We call on Russia to stop this senseless war. Immediately cease its assaults, withdraw all its forces from Ukraine, and turn back to the path of dialogue and turn away from aggression.
Jane, Jens Stoltenberg went on to say that NATO were activating their emergency response force for the first time. They will bolster defences in air, land and sea along the eastern flank. And Jane, also some speculation here in the last half an hour or so that President Biden could impose direct sanctions on President Putin, and that could potentially happen within the next few hours. Jane?
OK, Alison Petrosky there in Washington, D.C. Thank you. And international sporting bodies have reacted by cancelling events to be held in Russia this morning. UEFA moving the Champions League final scheduled for May from St Petersburg to Paris, while the Russian Grand Prix planned for September has been axed as Formula One drivers and racing teams speak out strongly against Russia. Eurovision has also taken a stand, kicking all Russian acts out of the 2022 song contest. As thousands of people flee Ukraine, this Australian couple is desperate to enter, trying to reach their baby daughter who was born prematurely by surrogate in Odessa. Parents Jess and Kevin are currently in Poland, and authorities say the journey is too dangerous, but they're determined to get her home safely.
I believe that there are Russian troops in Odessa, but I don't believe it's very pretty. Somehow there's got to be a way to get there. I'll swim if I have to.
The family will face major roadblocks to leave Ukraine, with birth certificates and emergency passports extremely hard to obtain.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has spoken with the Russian President Vladimir Putin this morning. In the phone call, President Xi said China supports Russia and Ukraine resolving through negotiations and called for the Cold War mentality to be abandoned. This will be of interest to Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who has called on China to back a crucial UN Security Council vote condemning President Putin. Well, the capital of Ukraine is the focus of a multi-pronged major attack by one of the world's most sophisticated militaries. An onslaught of tanks and weaponry breaching enemy lines in Ukraine. So why did Russia invade, and what does Vladimir Putin want this morning? Well, to understand it, you have to go back 30 years when the Soviet Empire collapsed. Ukraine became independent along with a number of other countries on the basis that NATO, that's the collection of Western democracies, wouldn't expand towards Moscow. Now, that was challenged in 2004 when some of these nations, including some of those that border Russia, became members of NATO, and now Ukraine wants to join as well. That angered Vladimir Putin, who has sought guarantees that Ukraine will be permanently barred from joining the US-led alliance. Western leaders have rejected those demands, and now we have war in Europe. Vladimir Putin eyeing regime change in Ukraine and expansion towards the old Soviet borders, and importantly for him, undermining the democratically elected governments that threaten his autocratic grip on power in Russia. Now I want to actually cross to Russia, to former CNN Moscow bureau chief Jill Doherty for an update. Jill, firstly, good morning to you in Australian time, good evening where you are. Russians have arrested thousands of people over anti-war protests. What is the feeling like on the streets of Moscow?
You know, it's kind of a mixed bag, really, Charles. If you look at the polling about Russians in general, they tend overwhelmingly to support this military action. But if you look a little bit more closely, one of the reasons is obviously that the media, government-controlled state TV, they're showing pictures constantly of Ukrainians and depicting them as neo-Nazis, etc. So this is really having an effect on a lot of people here. But you have, as you just said, had a number of protesters who have gone on the streets. There aren't quite a lot of them. Today there were more. And according to the organization that is monitoring how many people have been arrested, it was over 400. So there are people who are out there. Interestingly, even the daughter of the press secretary for President Putin, her name is Lisa Peskova, and she is kind of an influencer. She has an Instagram channel, etc. And she had on Instagram this phrase that people are now using, "No to war, нет войне." That was taken down very quickly, but it shows there are these younger, I would call them influencers, social media, who are speaking out against the war. But overwhelmingly, you know, Russians at this point still seem to support it because they believe, watching state TV, that it's actually Russia that is under attack and it's dangerous for Russia.
We in Australia and throughout the United States have seen how difficult it can be to have these long and protracted occupations of foreign territory. How is the resolve there in Russia if this goes on for weeks, for months, potentially years, and you start seeing Russian troops killed? How will that impact, do you think, the resolve of those Russian citizens?
You know, that is a very good question because there have been military operations. You look at going back to Afghanistan in the late 1980s, and one of the reasons that came to an end was because of the people who died. Chechnya, there were a number, you know, huge numbers of Russian soldiers who were killed. And in other, like in Syria, they did not have as many because it was pretty much an air operation. But I think that is one of the concerns that this government, the Russian government, would have to have. That if you see Russian soldiers being killed in Ukraine, that could have an influence. And speaking of that very interesting piece of video this morning, President Putin, remember, as we all know, he was a former KGB officer, and so maybe he's engaging in a little bit of psyops, psychological operations. But he had a video this morning in which he directly spoke to the Ukrainian military. And he said, you know, you should take power in your own hands. In other words, you know, move against the Ukrainian government, which he calls terrorists, and this is all in quotes, terrorists, drug addicts, and neo-Nazis. So the rhetoric has really, really been inflamed. That was, to me, quite a striking piece of video.
And unlike most wars, all playing out over social media as well, we appreciate your time and expertise this morning. I want to bring in international security expert John Blaxland, who's in Canberra for us this morning. John, good morning to you. We're hearing the Ukrainian government is arming roughly 18,000 citizens. Realistically, though, how long can they hold off an advancing Russian army?
Well, you know, as Mike Tyson once said, you know, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
Yeah.
And Vladimir Putin's plan may not necessarily go according to his schedule. And his appeal to the Ukrainian army would suggest actually maybe an act of desperation. Certainly, there is a, you know, considerable resistance. Very interesting how what's happened here is actually acting as a catalyst for global responses. Very interesting also to see Anonymous, a cyber hacking group, hacking into Russian government instrumentalities, and RT, Russia Today, the media mogul in Russia. This is not over. This is not a one-way street. Vladimir Putin doesn't get to call all the shots. And, you know, Russia's just been barred from Eurovision, so I don't know what effect that will have on morale in Russia. But the idea that this is all just, you know, as Jill pointed out, you know, a picture that's about terrorism and about neo-Nazis. You're right. I mean, Vladimir Putin controls much of the message inside Russia. So it's hard to get any kind of counter-argument in there. But Vladimir Zelensky himself has actually directly done this to the Russian people in his address yesterday, which was actually in Russian, addressing them and speaking in a very reasonable way about how absurd it is what's going on.
John, we're short on time. I just want to get one question to you beforehand. Are you surprised, do you think Vladimir Putin will be surprised with how unified NATO and the West have been in their response?
Look, I think you're right. The bottom line is, after Afghanistan, with Olaf Scholz coming to office and Emmanuel Macron wanting to, you know, spread his wings and assert French, you know, foreign policy leadership, he assumed there would be more division. But this is having a really interesting catalyst effect. There is resolve emerging. And I'm not sure that he anticipated quite how severely the world would react. This is not, and we've seen the United States appealing to China too about issues about sovereignty. This is something we haven't been giving much attention to. But if you undermine the principles of sovereignty, then what does it say about Tibet? What does it say about Xinjiang? And what does it say about China's claims to Taiwan and elsewhere? Legitimacy, it's a two-way street.
Russian forces rolling through northern parts of Kyiv as Vladimir Putin urges Ukrainian soldiers to overthrow their own government. US correspondent Michael Genovese has the latest developments.
Kyiv is a city on edge. A Russian takeover predicted within days. The tanks have been filmed moving through the city's outskirts, vision showing one ramming into oncoming traffic. The rush to leave has meant chaos at the city's train stations. Parts of Kyiv are already under fire from Russian missiles.
My mother screaming, wake up, wake up. I'm waking, all in the dust, screaming.
An enemy plane shot down by Ukrainian fighters, crashing and setting fire to an apartment block. The city's centre is heavily fortified as the soldiers brace for what's coming. Beneath Kyiv, locals will spend another night bunkered in the subway system. Russia's military claims it's now controlling a key airport just 7 kilometres from Kyiv. Ukraine's leader believes he is target number one. Disappointed with the response from Western allies, including the US, Volodymyr Zelensky is discussing a plan to meet with Kremlin officials in Belarus to end the bloodshed as Russian troops advance from the north, west and south. The aggressors reportedly surprised by the level of Ukraine's resistance. Vladimir Putin is urging Ukraine fighters to turn on their leaders and overthrow their own government. The Russian president briefing his Security Council on territory gains. It's estimated more than 50,000 Ukrainians have fled their homes. At the Polish border, many met with open arms and offers of free transport. Those who stayed are counting the cost and bracing for more.